50 tour buses. Not 10, not 20, 50, rolling down my private road, through my gate, onto my land. The HOA president had sold scenic tours, through my property to a travel company, without asking me, without telling me, without my name appearing anywhere in a single document. And they had been doing it for 8 months. Until the morning I changed the lock. Bus number 1 hit that gate at 7:43 a.m. By bus number 3, they understood something had gone very wrong. By bus number 50, the HOA president was on his knees. Before this story goes any further, and I want you to understand, it goes much further. Welcome to HOA Gone Too Far. This channel exists for one reason, because some HOAs cross the line, and every single one of them needs to be held accountable. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now. Ring that bell, because we post stories like this every single week. And trust me, you do not want to miss a single one of them. Let me tell you about the road first, because the road is the center of everything. Without understanding the road, none of the rest of this makes the kind of sense it deserves to make. I own 48 acres in the hill country of central Texas. I bought it 11 years ago with money I had saved over 15 years of working in commercial construction, every overtime shift, every weekend job. Every year I told myself that the land was coming and I just needed to be patient enough to get there. When I finally found this property, I understood immediately why it had sat on the market for as long as it had. The acreage was beautiful, rolling hills, 2 seasonal creeks, a stand of old-growth cedar along the northern boundary that made the air smell like nothing else in the world. But the access was complicated. The only road into the property ran through a narrow corridor between my eastern boundary and the edge of a residential development called Ridgecrest Estates. The development had been built in phases between 2009 and 2015, and it shared approximately half a mile of boundary with my eastern fence line. The road, my private road, deeded to my property, maintained entirely at my own expense, ran along that shared boundary before turning west onto my land. From the development's perspective, my road was the most scenic approach to the hill country that any resident could see from their back windows. The rolling landscape, the cedar stands, the creek crossings, all of it visible from the road that ran along the shared fence line. I had never thought of it as scenic. I had thought of it as mine. The HOA president was a man named Dale Whitmore. Dale was 60 years old, recently retired from a career in hospitality and events management, and he had brought that professional background directly into his HOA presidency the same way a hammer brings itself to every problem it encounters. In Dale's world, everything was an opportunity, and opportunities existed to be monetized. In his first year as president, Dale had launched what he called the Ridgecrest Community Experience Initiative, a series of programs designed to enhance the neighborhood's profile and generate what he described as community revenue streams. A neighborhood market on weekends, a holiday lights tour in December, a partnership with a local winery for a summer event series. All of this happened on HOA common property. All of it was whatever you thought of the approach, at least within the general neighborhood of what an HOA president might legitimately do. But Dale had bigger ideas. What Dale had identified was a regional tour company called Hill Country Scenic Routes that operated guided bus tours through the Texas Hill Country for corporate groups, tourists, and retirement communities. The company had been looking for new routes to add to their portfolio, something that offered genuine scenic value and a sense of private exclusivity that their clients would pay a premium for. Dale had approached them with a proposal. A private road through authentic hill country terrain, old growth cedar, creek crossings, rolling topography, a 45-minute scenic loop that felt nothing like the public roads their buses usually traveled. The tour company loved it. They signed a contract with Dale for 3 tours per week at a per bus rate that I later learned was $250 per vehicle. The road Dale had sold them was my road. The land the buses would travel through was my land, and my name appeared nowhere in the contract. I did not know any of this was happening. I was not home most weeks. My construction work kept me in Austin from Monday through Friday, and I drove out to property on weekends. The tours ran on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday mornings. By the time I arrived each Saturday, the tire tracks on the week's buses had been largely worn down by the weather and my own truck traffic. For 8 months, I drove past the evidence of what was happening and did not see it. The first sign came on a Saturday morning in March when I was doing my regular fence check along the eastern boundary. The road surface near the first creek crossing showed a level of wear that I could not explain for my own use alone. The gravel was compacted differently. The shoulder edges were breaking down in a pattern that suggested regular heavy vehicle traffic. I stood at that creek crossing and looked at the road. Something was using this road. Something large. Something regular. Something that was not me. I drove the full length of the road back to the gate. The gate I had installed myself 8 years ago. Heavy steel, built to last, padlocked every time I left the property. It was locked when I arrived that morning. It was always locked when I arrived, except someone had a key. I just did not know it yet. I installed a trail camera that same weekend. Nothing sophisticated. A standard wildlife camera mounted on a cedar post beside the gate, angled to capture the full approach road and the gate itself. The kind of thing any landowner in Texas keeps around for game monitoring. I set it to motion-activated video and drove back to Austin on Sunday evening without thinking too much more about it. The following Saturday, I pulled a memory card. What I found on it changed everything. Tuesday morning at 7:41 a.m., a full-size motor coach, white with blue lettering reading Hill Country Scenic Routes, turning off the county road onto my private road. The gate was already open. A man in a polo shirt, not someone I recognized, not someone who had ever spoken to me, was standing at the gate holding it wide and waving the bus through with the comfortable authority of someone who had done this many times before. Wednesday morning, another bus, same gate man, same routine. Thursday morning, 2 buses, back-to-back, 15 minutes apart. 3 days, 4 buses, in 1 week, on my private road, through my lock gate, with a key I had never given anyone. I sat in my truck at the kitchen table of my weekend cabin and watched the footage 3 times. My hands were completely still. My mind was working through the implications in the specific order that matters when something this large reveals itself all at once. Someone had a copy of my gate key. Someone had arranged commercial vehicle access to my private property. Someone was making money from my land without my knowledge or consent. I spent that Saturday pulling every piece of documentation I had for the property. The deed, the road easement language, which was clear that the road was private, deeded exclusively to my parcel, with no provision for third-party access of any kind. My property tax records, my liability insurance policy, which specifically noted the private road as a covered asset. Then I drove slowly along the road and photographed every section. The worn gravel at the creek crossing, the compacted shoulders, the tire track patterns that a commercial motor coach leaves that are completely distinct from a pickup truck. I measured the width of the track impressions and compared them to the standard wheelbase of the coach visible in the camera footage. They matched exactly. I did not confront anyone that weekend. I did not call Dale. I did not call the tour company. I drove home to Austin on Sunday evening with a memory card full of evidence and a very clear understanding that what I did next needed to be done correctly. I called a property attorney named James Calloway on Monday morning. James had represented me on a boundary matter 3 years earlier, and I trusted his judgment completely. I described what I had found. He listened without interrupting. "How long do you think this has been going on?" he asked. "At least since the summer," I said. "Possibly longer." "Do you have the footage?" 8 months a weekend worth, I said. Every bus that came through while the camera was running. James was quiet for a moment. "Before we do anything," he said, "I want you to do one more thing. I want you to find out exactly how much money has been made from your road." It took me 2 weeks. Hill Country Scenic Routes had a public booking page. Their Hill Country tour was listed as a premium private route experience at a per group rate. Using the booking records I could access publicly, corporate event pages, group tour reviews with dates, social media posts from tour participants, I was able to construct a rough timeline going back 9 months. 3 tours per week, average 1 to 2 buses per tour, $250 per bus. 9 months. The conservative estimate was just under $40,000 in tour revenue generated from my private road. $40,000 generated from my land, using my road, without my knowledge, without my consent, without my name anywhere. James called me the morning after I sent him the calculation. "Now we are ready," he said. James and I had a plan. It was not complicated. The best plans rarely are. But it required precise timing, and it required me to do one thing before any legal action was initiated. One thing that would create an undeniable, documented, public record of exactly what the HOA had arranged on my property. I needed to change the lock. Not metaphorically. Literally. I needed to install a new padlock on my gate, a lock for which no copy of the key existed anywhere except in my own possession. And I needed to do it on a specific night at a specific time, so that the following morning's tour schedule would run directly into it. James had obtained the tour company's booking schedule through a formal records request. The next scheduled tour day was a Thursday. 3 buses booked. First departure from the staging area at 7:30 a.m. Estimated gate arrival at 7:43. I drove out to property Wednesday evening. I removed the old padlock, the one someone had duplicated, without my permission. I set it on the seat of my truck. I installed a new heavy-duty steel padlock, tested it 3 times, locked the gate, stood back and looked at it in the last light of the evening. That gate had been used by 50 buses without my knowledge. It would not open for one more. I drove my truck to a position about 200 yards from the gate, behind a stand of cedar where it was not visible from the road. I had a thermos of coffee, my phone, my camera, and James on standby. I did not sleep much that night. At 7:43 a.m., bus number 1 turned off the county road onto my private road. I watched it through the cedar trees. Full-size motor coach, white with blue lettering. 47 passengers visible through the windows. Corporate group from the matching polo shirts. A tour guide standing at the front of the bus talking to group, gesturing at the landscape outside. The bus rolled up to my gate and stopped. The gate man, the same man I had seen in months of camera footage, climbed off the bus and walked to the padlock. He tried his key. It did not turn. He tried it again, looked at the lock, tried again. He stood at the gate for 2 full minutes trying a key that no longer worked. Then he got back on the bus and got on his phone. 7:51 a.m. Bus number 2 arrived behind bus number 1. Also stopped. The drivers of both buses climbed out and stood on my private road, looking at the gate, then looking at each other, then looking at their phones. 8:04 a.m. Bus number 3 arrived. 3 full-size motor coaches, now lined up on my private road. 131 passengers total. Tour guides on 3 separate phones simultaneously. The gate man trying to key a 4th time. A 5th time, beginning to understand that the lock had changed and that there was no version of this morning that ended with those buses going through. I called James. "They are all here," I said. "I am on my way to the HOA office." James said, "Give me 40 minutes." I stayed behind the cedar trees and watched. The tour company's operations manager arrived at 8:20 in a company truck. He walked to the gate, examined the new lock, looked at my property beyond the gate, the road, the cedar stands, the first creek crossing visible in the morning light, and then turned and looked at the 3 buses lined up behind him. He made a phone call. At 8:35, Dale Whitmore's truck appeared at the end of my road. He drove slowly toward the gate, slowly in a way that people drive when they're already calculating what they're going to say and how they're going to say it. He parked, got out, looked at the 3 buses, looked at the gate, looked at the new lock, and then he just stood there. I want to describe that moment carefully because I think it matters. Dale Whitmore had spent 8 months building something on land that was not his. He had taken the initiative, made the calls, signed the contracts, collected the revenue, and operated with the confidence of a man who had decided that availability was the same thing as permission. And he was standing at a locked gate on a private road, with 3 buses full of people who had paid for a tour that was not going to happen, and a new lock that told him everything he needed to know about where this day was heading. He looked like a man who had just understood, for the first time, the full weight of what he had done. I stepped out from behind the cedar trees and walked toward the gate. Dale saw me coming. He recognized me. We had met twice at neighborhood boundary discussions years earlier. His expression went through several things very quickly. Recognition, calculation, and then something I can only describe as the look of a man who has run out of moves. "There seems to be a problem with the lock," he said. "No," I said. "There's a new lock. There is no problem with it at all. It works exactly as it should." I held up my phone. On the screen was a compilation of camera footage. 8 months of buses on my road. My gate being open with a duplicated key. Tour after tour running through my private property. "My attorney is at your HOA office right now," I said. "I suggest you go meet him." Dale looked at the footage, looked at the gate, looked at the 3 buses, and then he got in his truck and drove away. I need to pause right here, because what I just described, 3 buses on a private road, a new lock, 8 months of evidence, Dale driving away without a single word. That is just the beginning of what happened. If you are watching HOA Gone Too Far for the first time right now, please subscribe before we go any further, because what James found at that HOA office, and what the tour company did next, and what Dale's contract actually revealed, is the part that makes this story complete. Subscribe. Ring the bell. Let's finish this. James arrived at the Ridgecrest HOA office at 8:50 a.m. He had called ahead, not to warn anyone, but to ensure that the office was open and that a board member was present. Under Texas HOA law, a property owner with a documented dispute against the association has the right to inspect certain HOA records upon request. James had prepared the request the night before. The office manager, a woman named Carol who had nothing to do with any of what Dale had arranged and who would later become one of the most cooperative witnesses in the entire proceeding, opened the filing cabinet and pointed James to everything he asked for. The contract between the Ridgecrest HOA and Hill Country Scenic Routes was in the second drawer. James read it on the spot. It was 11 pages. It identified the HOA as the landowner of record for the scenic route. It described the road access in detail, the entry point, the creek crossings, the cedar stands, the full 45-minute loop. It specified the per bus rate of $250. It included a revenue-sharing arrangement under which Dale personally received a 10% advisory fee for having developed and managed the partnership. Dale was personally receiving a 10% cut from revenue generated on land he did not own, through a contract that identified the HOA as a landowner of record. When the land was mine, had always been mine, was documented as mine in every public record that existed. James photographed every page. Then he asked Carol for the HOA's financial records for the previous 12 months. Carol opened another drawer. The revenue line was labeled Community Scenic Partnership. $38,400. Deposited in 11 separate transfers over 9 months. Every transfer corresponding to a tour date on the booking schedule James had already obtained. The 10% advisory fee to Dale, labeled in the records as President Administrative Consulting, totaled $3,840 paid directly to Dale from HOA funds that originated from my property. James called me from the parking lot of the HOA office. "I have everything," he said. "How bad is it?" I asked. "It is as complete a case as I have seen in 20 years of property law," he said. "Unauthorized commercial use of private property, fraudulent representation of land ownership to a third party, self-dealing through an undisclosed personal financial arrangement, and a revenue figure that makes this well above the threshold for serious civil damages. What about the tour company?" I asked. "They acted in good faith based on Dale's representation," James said. "Their liability is different from his, but they have been operating commercial tours on your private property for 9 months. They have exposure, and they are going to want to resolve this quickly and quietly." James filed a civil complaint that afternoon against the Ridgecrest HOA, against Dale Whitmore personally. Trespass, unauthorized commercial appropriation of private property, fraudulent misrepresentation of land ownership to a third-party vendor, unjust enrichment, and a damages calculation that included the full revenue figure, the estimated road restoration costs from 9 months of heavy vehicle traffic and attorney fees. He also filed a formal complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission regarding Dale's misrepresentation of property ownership in a commercial contract. And he sent a formal notice to Hill Country Scenic Routes informing them that the land they had been using for 9 months was private property, that the contract they had signed was based on a fraudulent representation of ownership, and that all future tours on that route were immediately prohibited. Hill Country Scenic Routes canceled the contract the same day. Their attorney called James the following morning and expressed, in the carefully calibrated language of people who have made a serious mistake and know it, a strong desire to reach a resolution. Dale, for his part, retained a defense attorney in Austin and filed an answer to complaint that attempted to characterize the road use as consistent with a historical pattern of community access to adjacent land. James read the answer and called me. He is arguing community access. James said, "Can he do that?" I asked. He can argue it. James said, "It will not work. Not against 9 months of dated camera footage showing commercial motor coaches on a deeded private road. Not against a contract in which he personally represented your land as HOA property. Not against a self-dealing payment arrangement that he approved for himself without board disclosure. He has no path through this case, and his attorney knows it." The settlement negotiation took 10 weeks. 3 separate parties. The HOA, Dale Whitmore personally, and Hill Country Scenic Routes. 3 separate attorneys. 3 separate calculations of liability. All of them ultimately pointing in the same direction, toward a number that reflected 9 months of unauthorized commercial use of private property and the full legal exposure that came with it. James described the negotiations to me afterward as the most efficiently settled case he had handled in years. Not because the numbers were small, they were not, but because the liability was so thoroughly documented and so completely indefensible that every negotiation session began with the other side already knowing where it was going. The HOA settlement covered road restoration costs in full. A licensed civil engineer had assessed the damage to the road surface from 9 months of motor coach traffic, compacted gravel, eroded creek crossing approaches, damaged drainage culverts along 2 sections. The restoration figure came to just over $18,000. The HOA paid it without meaningful resistance. The damages payment for unauthorized commercial use was calculated at the full revenue figure plus a multiplier that James had argued represented the minimum appropriate compensation for unauthorized commercial appropriation of private land. Dale's attorney negotiated the multiplier down from what James had initially sought. The final figure was something I will not state publicly, but that I will describe as more than sufficient. Dale's personal settlement covered the advisory fee he had paid himself, $3,840, returned in full with interest, plus a portion of the damages attributable to his personal misrepresentation of land ownership in the commercial contract. His defense attorney had, in the end, advised him strongly against going to trial with the evidence that existed. Hill Country Scenic Routes settled separately. Their exposure was different from Dale's. They had genuinely relied on his representation of authority, but they had operated commercial tours on private property for 9 months, and they had a business reputation to protect. Their settlement was resolved quickly and confidentially, and their attorney expressed something that sounded, through the formal language of legal correspondence, like genuine relief that it was over. The Texas Real Estate Commission investigation into Dale's conduct concluded 4 months later. The findings were significant. Misrepresentation of property ownership in a commercial transaction. Undisclosed self-dealing in a fiduciary capacity. The commission issued a formal censure and placed conditions on any future real estate-related activities Dale might undertake in the state. The HOA recall petition was organized by a group of Ridgecrest residents who had followed the proceedings through neighborhood channels and who had, in the process, discovered that the Community Scenic Partnership revenue, $38,000 generated from land the HOA did not own, had been reported to homeowners in the annual budget as community enhancement income without any explanation of its source. They had been told their HOA was generating revenue. They had not been told it was generating revenue from someone else's private property. The recall succeeded with 71% of participating homeowners voting to remove Dale. His presidency ended on a Tuesday evening in April. I was not present for the meeting. I had no need to be. The new HOA president was a woman named Susan Park, who called me the week after her election and introduced herself in the direct, practical way of someone who's been elected specifically to fix something and intends to do exactly that. I want you to know that the board has engaged a property attorney to review our governing documents, she said, and that any future community initiative involving land use will require documented consent from every affected property owner before it proceeds. That is all I ever needed, I said. I know, she said. I am sorry it took this to produce it. The road was restored that summer. A gravel company spent 4 days regrading and resurfacing the full length of it. New culverts at the creek crossings. Fresh drainage cuts along the eroded sections. When they finished, the road looked better than it had in years. I drove at the evening they completed the work. Slowly, the whole length of it, through the cedar stands and across the creek crossings and up the rise that give you the first full view of the hill country spreading west of the horizon. It is a beautiful road. I know that now in a way I did not before, in the specific way that you understand the value of something after someone has tried to take it from you and failed. It is my road. The gate at the end of it has a new lock, and the only key to that lock is on my keychain. That is exactly where it will stay. Some people see land and see available space. They see a road and see a route. They see a gate and see an obstacle between them and something they want. What they do not see, what Dale did not see, is that available space belongs to someone, and that someone, when they find out, is going to want it back. Every single time. Before you go, one question, and I want you to really think about it. If you drove up to your own gate one morning and found 3 tour buses lined up on your private road, drivers looking at you, tourists looking at you, a man on his phone pretending he has no idea how this happened, what is the very first thing you do? Do you open the gate and let them through? Do you call the police immediately? Do you call a lawyer first? Or do you do something that nobody in this story thought of? Tell me in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if someone has ever treated your land like it was available just because it was open, I want to hear that story too. A gate is just a gate until someone tries to open it without permission. Then it becomes everything. HOA Gone Too Far exists for every person. Who has ever had an HOA decide that their property was available? Their road was convenient. Their land was an opportunity. Subscribe right now. Ring that bell. Share this with anyone who owns land, owns property, or has ever had a neighbor who looked at their fence and saw a revenue stream because some HOAs go too far, and every single one of them needs to be held accountable. Thank you for watching HOA Gone Too Far. I will see you in the next one.